Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. This whole mess started about 6 months ago when our neighborhood got a new HOA board president who apparently decided that her life mission was to make everyone else miserable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me give you some background first. I'm a professional land surveyor, which means I spend most of my time looking at property lines, measurements, and making sure everything follows regulations. It's made me pretty detail-oriented, and I've got some decent camera equipment for documenting sites. I've been living in my current neighborhood for about 5 years now with my wife and our 2 pets. It's a nice, middle-class area that was built in the early 2000s, nothing too fancy but well-maintained. Our pets are honestly the most harmless animals you could imagine. There's our golden retriever, who's about 12 years old and weighs around 75 pounds. He's basically a sentient loaf of bread at this point. The most exercise he gets is walking from his food bowl to his favorite sunny spot on the living room carpet. Then there's our Maine Coon cat, who's indoor only and spends most of his time judging us from various high perches around the house. Neither of them has ever caused any problems with neighbors, no barking complaints, no property damage, nothing. The neighborhood used to be pretty chill about things like this. Sure, we had an HOA, but they mostly focused on obvious stuff like keeping your grass cut and not painting your house purple. The previous board president was this retired guy who just wanted to make sure the community pool stayed clean and the playground equipment didn't fall apart. Simple stuff. Then last fall, this woman who I'll call the president got elected to run the board. I should mention that this election happened at a meeting that maybe 10 people attended out of the entire 200-home neighborhood. Most of us didn't even know it was happening because the notice got buried in some generic newsletter that half the residents probably threw away without reading. The president had very different ideas about what our neighborhood should be. She kept talking about maintaining high-class standards and ensuring uniformity in everything. She was one of those people who used corporate buzzwords in casual conversation and always wore these perfectly pressed business casual outfits, even when she was just checking her mailbox. For the first few months, her changes were annoying but not devastating. She implemented new rules about when you could put your trash cans out and exactly where they had to be positioned. She sent around strongly worded reminders about approved paint colors and required approval for any landscaping changes. People grumbled, but most of us figured it would blow over. Then I got the letter. It came via certified mail, which should have been my first warning sign. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with the HOA logo printed in the corner. When I opened it, I found a formal Notice of Violation on HOA letterhead. The letter informed me that the board had recently passed Resolution 2023-15, which stated that pets residing within the community must not exceed 25 pounds in weight. Apparently, this rule had been voted on and approved at a board meeting the previous month, a meeting that, according to the letter, was properly noticed to all residents. I had never received any notice about this meeting. I checked with several neighbors, and none of them had heard about it either. But there it was in black and white, a new rule that basically made our dog illegal. The letter gave me exactly 30 days to rehome the non-compliant animal, or face daily fines of $100 starting on day 31. It was signed by the president and included copies of the relevant sections of our updated CC&Rs. I was stunned. Our dog had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years without a single complaint. He was clearly a senior animal who spent most of his time sleeping. The idea that he was somehow a threat to anyone was ridiculous. I decided to call the president directly to discuss this. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding, or perhaps we could work out some kind of grandfather clause for existing pets. The conversation did not go well. She answered on the second ring and immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about how the board was committed to maintaining property values and ensuring a peaceful living environment for all residents. When I tried to explain that our dog was elderly and completely harmless, she cut me off. "Rules are rules," she said in this condescending tone that made my teeth hurt. "We're trying to keep this a high-class community, not a kennel. If residents wanted to live with large animals, they should have chosen a rural area instead of a planned community." I pointed out that I had been living here for 5 years with no issues and that the rule seemed to have been passed without proper notice to residents. She dismissed this immediately. "All meetings are properly noticed according to state law," she said. "It's not the board's responsibility to personally invite every resident to participate in community governance. If you were truly concerned about HOA matters, you would make an effort to stay informed." The call ended with her suggesting that I consult the recent updates to our governing documents, and reminding me that fines would begin automatically if the situation wasn't resolved within the required time frame. I hung up feeling frustrated and angry, but also starting to get suspicious. Something about her attitude and the way this rule had appeared out of nowhere didn't sit right with me. In my line of work, when something seems off, it usually means someone isn't following proper procedures. That weekend, we had one of our neighborhood's monthly coffee in the park gatherings. These are informal social events where people bring their kids to the playground and catch up with neighbors. They're usually pretty relaxed affairs. I showed up hoping to talk to other pet owners and maybe get a sense of whether anyone else had received similar violations. What I got instead was a public humiliation that made it clear this was about more than just pet waits. The president was there with several other board members, and she made a point of approaching me while I was talking to a group of neighbors near the playground equipment. She was carrying a folder full of papers and had this sickeningly sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, there you are," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I was just telling everyone about how we're finally getting serious about enforcement around here. It's amazing how some people think they're above the community bylaws." She opened her folder and pulled out not one, but two official notices. The first was a copy of the pet violation I had already received. The second was completely new. "I also noticed during my neighborhood walk that you have a non-compliant pet gate visible through your front window," she announced. "Metal gates must be white or beige according to Section 12.4 of our architectural standards. Yours appears to be black." I was speechless. The gate she was referring to was a small baby gate that we used to keep our cat away from certain areas of the house. It was barely visible through one corner of our living room window, and you would have to be specifically looking for it to even notice it. The conversation around us had gone completely quiet. Everyone was staring, and I could see the mix of sympathy and embarrassment on their faces. Some people started drifting away, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "This will be a $50 violation with a 14-day correction period," she continued, handing me the second notice. "I trust you'll take care of both issues promptly." The other board members standing behind her all nodded seriously, like they were some kind of small-town mafia backing up their boss. It was clear that this wasn't really about pets or gates. This was about power and control, and I had somehow been selected as the example to make to the rest of the neighborhood. After they walked away, a few neighbors came over to express their sympathy, but most of them seemed nervous about being seen talking to me. One older gentleman who lived a few streets over pulled me aside. "She's been looking for someone to make an example of," he said quietly. "You're not the first person to get hit with multiple violations at once. Mrs. Johnson got 3 notices in 1 week about her flower colors being too bright." That conversation was when I realized I had a choice to make. I could roll over, pay the fines, get rid of our beloved family pets, and hope that kept the president happy. Or I could fight back. Given my professional background, I decided to fight back using the tools I understood best: documentation and regulations. The first thing I did was spend $50 to purchase a complete set of our neighborhood's legal documents from the county clerk's office. This included the original plat maps, the recorded CC&Rs, all amendments, and every meeting minute going back to when the HOA was first established. I also bought a digital copy of the current neighborhood survey that showed every property line and easement. Reading through 200 pages of HOA documents isn't exactly thrilling, but my training had taught me to spot inconsistencies and violations. What I found was interesting. The pet weight rule had indeed been passed at a board meeting, but the meeting notice had only been posted on the community website, not mailed to residents as required by our bylaws. More importantly, the rule change required a 60-day comment period before implementation, which had been completely skipped. But that was just the beginning of what I discovered. Since the president was so concerned about high-class standards and uniformity, I decided to take a systematic look at compliance throughout the neighborhood. I started spending my weekend morning dog walks documenting everything I could see with my professional-grade camera equipment. What I found was that while the board was crucifying me over a senior dog and a barely visible pet gate, they were completely ignoring massive violations on their own properties. The president herself lived in one of the larger homes near the entrance to the neighborhood. During my walks, I noticed that her backyard shed was significantly taller than it should be according to our architectural guidelines. I measured it from the property line using my surveying equipment and found it exceeded the height limit by almost 3 feet. More than that, it was painted in what she had called a non-approved shade of eggshell white instead of the required bright white specified in Section 8.3. The board treasurer had an even bigger problem. He had built an elaborate deck in his backyard that extended right up to the property line. Looking at the original plat maps, I could see that the last 6 feet of his deck was actually sitting on what should be common area drainage easement. This wasn't just an HOA violation, it was potentially a legal problem that could affect the entire neighborhood's drainage management. But the most obvious violation belonged to the board secretary. Our CC and Rs explicitly prohibit commercial vehicles from being parked in residential driveways overnight. The secretary had a work van with his company logo and phone number wrapped across the entire side panels parked in his driveway every single night. I watched for 2 weeks, and that van never moved to a different location. I documented everything meticulously. Photos with timestamps, GPS coordinates, measurements, and references to the specific sections of our governing documents that were being violated. I organized it all into what I called my compliance dossier. Then I sat down to plan my response. The beauty of malicious compliance is that you don't have to break any rules to make your point. You just have to follow them exactly as they're written, even when doing so creates uncomfortable situations for the people who wrote them. Our HOA bylaws require that all violations be reported to the board for action. They also specify that violation notices must be issued within 10 days of a reported infraction. There's no exception that allows board members to ignore violations on their own properties. I also noticed something interesting in our community directory. All residents were supposed to have access to the neighborhood email list for important community communications. I had never been given access to this list, but the directory included instructions for requesting it from the board secretary. So I sent the secretary a polite email requesting access to the community mailing list so I could stay better informed about HOA matters. He responded within a day with the entire email list, apparently not thinking about what I might do with it. Now, I had everything I needed. I spent the next evening crafting what I called my friendly reminder email. The tone was aggressively helpful and completely professional, like something you might get from a particularly thorough compliance officer. The subject line read, "Compliance Update, helping our board maintain high standards throughout the community." The email started by thanking the board for their renewed commitment to strict enforcement and expressing my appreciation for their efforts to maintain our neighborhood's high-class standards. I mentioned how much I had learned about our community rules since receiving my own violations and how inspiring it was to see leadership taking such a detailed approach to compliance. Then I got to the good part. Since the board is now strictly enforcing the 25-pound pet rule to maintain our uniformity standards, I assumed we are also strictly enforcing Section 8 regarding outbuilding specifications, Section 12 governing unpermitted structures, and Section 4.2 concerning commercial vehicle restrictions. To help the board begin the fine process for everyone, I've attached a helpful photo guide of current violations that require immediate attention. I attached my entire compliance dossier, complete with photos, measurements, and document references. Every violation was carefully labeled with the homeowner's address, the specific rule being broken, and the required remedy. I made sure to start with the board members' properties since they had set such a high standard for prompt enforcement. I ended the email by offering my professional surveying services at cost to help measure any properties where violations might be unclear and suggesting that we should all work together to achieve the uniformity and high-class standards that our leadership had so thoughtfully established. Then I hit send to the entire neighborhood mailing list. The response was immediate and dramatic. My phone started ringing within 20 minutes. The first call was from a neighbor thanking me for finally standing up to the board's selective enforcement. The second call was from another neighbor asking if I could document some violations they had noticed on their street. The third call was from the president, and she was furious. "This is completely inappropriate," she said without even identifying herself. "You have no authority to conduct inspections on private property." I pointed out that all of my photos had been taken from public areas and that I was simply following the reporting procedures outlined in our bylaws. If the board didn't want residents documenting violations, perhaps they should consider being more selective about which rules they chose to enforce. "You need to send a retraction email immediately," she demanded. "This kind of harassment won't be tolerated." I asked if she was saying that the board didn't intend to investigate and find the violations I had reported, since that would seem to contradict their commitment to uniform enforcement. The call ended with her hanging up on me, but the calls kept coming. By the end of the evening, I had heard from almost 20 neighbors. Some were thanking me, others were asking for advice about their own HOA problems, and a few were offering to help document additional violations they had noticed. More importantly, several people confirmed what I had suspected about the pet rule meeting. None of them had received proper notice, and at least 3 of them had been looking for information about board meetings but hadn't been able to find it posted anywhere except buried on the community website. The next morning, I found a notice in my mailbox announcing an emergency executive session of the HOA board scheduled for the following evening. All residents were invited to attend, and the agenda listed discussion of community standards enforcement as the primary topic. I knew this was going to be their attempt to shut me down, but I was ready for them. The emergency meeting was held in the community center, and the turnout was massive by neighborhood standards. Usually, board meetings attracted maybe 5 or 6 people. This one had close to 50 residents packed into the meeting room. The president opened the meeting by expressing her disappointment with recent attempts to undermine board authority through inappropriate communications. She didn't name me directly, but everyone knew what she was talking about. She explained that the board took all violations seriously, but that they had to prioritize based on community impact and available resources. Some violations, she said, were more urgent than others, and residents needed to trust the board's judgment about enforcement priorities. Then she made the mistake that sealed her fate. "We cannot allow individual residents to take enforcement into their own hands," she said. "This type of vigilante behavior threatens the stability of our community governance." That's when I stood up. I should mention that I had done my research about recording laws in our state. We're a one-party consent state, which means you can record conversations as long as you're part of them. I had my phone recording the entire meeting. "I appreciate the board's concern about enforcement priorities," I said, "but I'm confused about the criteria being used. Could you explain why a 12-year-old dog that has never received a single complaint is considered a higher priority than unpermitted structures on drainage easements?" She tried to deflect by saying that different types of violations required different expertise to evaluate, but I wasn't backing down. "I have professional surveying credentials and access to the original plat maps," I continued. "I'd be happy to provide detailed measurements for any structural violations the board would like to investigate. In fact, I've already documented several that appear to violate not just HOA rules, but potentially city codes as well." That got everyone's attention. I pulled out printed copies of my compliance dossier and started walking through the most obvious violations. I made sure to point out that these weren't minor issues like pet gate colors, but actual structural problems that could affect property values and neighborhood drainage. When I got to the treasurer's deck encroachment on the drainage easement, he tried to interrupt by claiming that his contractor had assured him everything was compliant. I politely suggested that he might want to double-check those assurances, since the original neighborhood plat maps clearly showed the easement boundaries, and my measurements indicated a significant overlap. "If this becomes a city code enforcement issue," I said, "the fines and mandatory removal costs could be substantial. I would hate to see any neighbor face that kind of expense over something that could be resolved voluntarily." The room had gone completely quiet. Everyone understood what I was really saying. If the board continued to pursue the pet violations, I was prepared to escalate the much larger violations to city authorities, which would result in thousands of dollars in fines and forced compliance for the board members. The president tried one more time to regain control of the situation. "This is exactly the kind of hostile behavior that makes it difficult to maintain community harmony," she said. "Threatening legal action over minor property issues is completely inappropriate." But I had already won, and everyone in the room knew it. "I'm not threatening anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply following the same enforcement standards that the board has established. If my 12-year-old dog requires immediate compliance despite causing no problems for 5 years, then certainly unpermitted structures and commercial vehicle violations require the same level of attention." I paused to let that sink in, then delivered what I hoped would be the final blow. "Of course, if the board determined that some violations deserved special consideration due to circumstances like age, health, or the lack of any actual problems caused, I would completely support that kind of reasoned approach to enforcement." The meeting ended without any formal votes, but the message was clear. The board was trapped between their own rigid enforcement stance and the much larger violations I had documented on their properties. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved quickly. The president announced that she would be stepping back from active leadership to focus on personal projects. The treasurer quietly hired a contractor to modify his deck to comply with easement requirements. The secretary started parking his work van at a friend's business overnight instead of in his own driveway. Most importantly, the board called a special meeting to discuss clarifications to recent policy changes. At that meeting, they introduced Resolution 2023-18, which established a senior pet variance for animals over 8 years old who had been living in the community without incident for more than 2 years. The variance would allow these animals to remain regardless of weight as long as they continued to be well-behaved and properly cared for. The resolution passed unanimously. They also announced that they would be reviewing the notification procedures for rule changes to ensure that all residents received proper notice of proposed modifications to community standards. But the most satisfying part came a few weeks later. The former president had to have her shed completely rebuilt to meet height requirements. She also had to repaint it in the approved bright white color, which she apparently hated because it clashed with the rest of her house's color scheme. I happened to be walking our dog past her house on the day the painting crew finished. She was standing in her driveway staring at the freshly painted shed with obvious dismay. Our dog, completely oblivious to all the drama he had caused, wandered over to investigate a particularly interesting smell near her mailbox. She looked at him, then at me, and for a moment I thought she might say something. Instead, she just shook her head and went back inside. The new board president is a retired teacher who actually lives in the neighborhood, unlike some previous board members. She's implemented a monthly coffee meeting where residents can discuss issues informally before they become formal violations. She's also established clear procedures for rule changes that require mailed notice to all residents and a genuine comment period. Our neighborhood has become a much more reasonable place to live. As I'm writing this, our golden retriever is sprawled across most of our living room floor, snoring loudly and completely unaware that he was briefly the most controversial resident in our community. Our cat is perched on his favorite windowsill, presumably planning whatever cats plan when they stare out windows for hours. The black pet gate is still visible through our front window, and nobody has said a word about it. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with petty authoritarians. Sometimes the best response isn't to argue with their rules, but to insist that they apply those same rules to everyone equally. Amazing how quickly unreasonable policies become reasonable when the people making them have to live by them too. I still keep my compliance dossier updated just in case. But mostly these days I use my surveying skills and camera equipment for more pleasant purposes, like helping neighbors figure out property lines for new garden projects or documenting the progress of various home improvement efforts. And sometimes, when I'm walking our perfectly legal senior dog past the former president's bright white shed, I can't help but smile a little bit. Because rules are rules after all. The next one is a malicious compliance story. 20-plus years ago now, I worked at a landscaping supply business driving a dump truck. I've been a software engineer for most of the time since, but at that time, well, mistakes were made, and I spent a few years driving a truck. These were single-axle trucks, 26,000 pounds gross. We often overloaded them by about a ton. Mesquita was on the edge of the area we often delivered to, and we occasionally took rock or mulch to the high school there. I arrived one day with probably 4 or 5 tons of topsoil. If I recall correctly, I had to drive around the school and find someone. I suspect I had been instructed on where to meet people, and those people weren't there. I asked after the name I had on the delivery ticket. It was written on there like I should know who they were. When I found someone behind the school and was informed that it was a math or physics, I don't recall, but something STEM-related, teacher I was looking for. I think I asked that person if they could find the teacher for me. Eventually, I met the teacher and 3 or 4 students in front of the school. I didn't know any of them. I might have still been 19 or 20 at the time, and I looked young. It wasn't rare to be forced to find people for a delivery, and everything was normal so far. I got out of the truck and was told that the dirt was to be dumped into a planter they had been assembling with decorative blocks around the sign for the high school. It was out, maybe 50, into the grass between the road and the parking lot in front of the school. I hesitated and might have managed to say, before being interrupted. I was going to say that the truck would leave marks in the grass. The truck, at 12,000 pounds empty, was heavy enough that it would compress the dirt, and even though the grass would only be flattened, it would leave a trail anywhere the truck went, likely an inch or 2 deep that wouldn't go away anytime soon. The tracks would be conspicuous. I don't recall if I got more than 1 syllable out before I was interrupted with a condescending tone, initially from the teacher, and then from 1 or 2 of the students. I tried to speak again, and again I was met with a mix of disbelief that I didn't understand the instructions, and further attempts to explain what they wanted me to do as though I was 5 years old or didn't speak English. I believe I attempted to speak 2 or 3 times before giving up. I acquiesced, got back in the truck, and proceeded to drive out into the grass, leaving ruts that the groundskeepers would regret for years to come. The grass will be cut off level above these ruts, but you'll still feel them when you drive over them with a mower. I backed the truck up to one side of the planter and dumped dirt in until it was piled above the small semi-oval retaining wall, and I was signaled to stop. The sign was in the middle of the planter, which meant that the pile was only on one side. The other side was pretty much empty. I expected that we would want to drive to the other side of planter. When you dump enough piles of something, you get a feel for what it's going to take to fill a space. But after being told to stop, I got out to suggest that they would want more dirt here to fill the entire planter. Again, I was not able to finish a sentence. I attempted to tell them that when they spread the dirt out in the planter, it wasn't going to be anywhere near the brim. I also would have been willing to stay while they moved some dirt over to the bare area so we could dump more in without spilling out onto the grass. It was clear they had no use for anything I might have to say. The disrespect was clearly intentional. I'm not sure if there was some perceived slight or if this was just a wolf pack who did this to everyone. I was told to go dump the remaining soil. There was probably 2 or 3 tons left in the truck. It could have been put to good use in the planter still, out in a row crop field back behind the school. Here's another intricacy of working with a dump truck you might not intuit. Dirt doesn't spread evenly out of a dump bed. Most trucks have chains for the gate that allow you to meter how quickly the material comes out of the truck. These work great with small rock and gravel. With material that's more prone to clumping, you set the chain such that the gate can open wider and be less prone to clogging, but for dirt and mulch, it effectively just doesn't work. It hits the gate, compacts a bit, and is clogged. Then you can't release the chains because there are thousands of pounds of material pressed against it. You have to dig it out, which is a lot of work even with gravity helping, and of course the whole exercise was futile from the start. Thankfully, these people didn't know to ask, or I'm sure they would have directed me how to do my job, and then I would have been faced with either arguing with people who didn't care what I thought, or setting the chains and then spending 10 minutes unclogging the gate of the truck. You might guess there's too much nuance in that to convey in a scenario where I've yet to be allowed to finish a sentence. We weren't having a conversation and these people were enjoying this for some reason. This was a long time ago, and I don't remember much of what was said to me, but I do clearly remember one kid slowly explaining, "Just take the truck over there and drive while you dump it out," or something to that effect, with hand gestures like you would explain something to a child. By this point, I wouldn't piss on them if they were on fire, so I wasn't inclined to expose myself to any more of this noise. I had them sign for the delivery and then drove around the school and into the field. I felt a little bad for whoever farmed this field, so I actually did try to make it work as well as possible. I also doubted they had permission. I drove about as fast as I was willing to drive in a recently tilled field, and started raising the bed. As topsoil is wont to do, nothing happened until the entire mass started sliding and essentially landed in the field in a large pile. You could tell that, if you knew what you were looking at, the truck had been moving when it was dumped, but it was still a pile that someone was going to have to deal with. I drove past the school a week or so later on another delivery. I was curious to see if they had gone out to the field to get some of the nice sifted topsoil when they realized the planter was barely half filled, or to maybe use it to patch the ruts in the grass. There were still obvious tracks leading to the newly constructed planter. The planter was half filled with dirt, leaving the back of multiple courses of block exposed, and the large pile of dirt was still standing out in the field. The planter stayed that way for years. I don't know if anyone ever fixed it. The entire complex was apparently demolished and has been replaced with a new building now. I moved out of the area a long time ago. I'm not entirely certain that this was malicious compliance. I wasn't trying to be malicious, but I wasn't going to argue with people who were being both insulting and borderline hostile. I held that job way too long, maybe 6 years, so I certainly had more bad or weird encounters with customers, like the time I guess I disappointed a couple trying to have a delivery man three-way. But this one was one of the worst. The next one is an entitled People Story. I used to sell cell phones in a mall kiosk, which is a sentence that already explains everything you need to know about the moral landscape of this story. Imagine retail, but remove the walls, add fluorescent lighting that feels personally judgmental, and place it directly between a pretzel stand and a nail salon so the air is a rotating wheel of sugar, acetone, and despair. This is where I learned 2 important truths. 1. People do not read return policies. 2. Entitled people frequently smell like they are actively rebelling against the concept of soap. I worked for a major carrier, not naming which one because honestly, they are all the same Hydra wearing different polo shirts. We sold phones, plans, accessories, insurance, and the fragile illusion that technology would make people happy. Our return policy was printed on the receipt, the wall, the countermat, the website, and probably branded onto my soul. 14 days. Phone must be in like new condition. No water damage, no biohazards. This last part was implied, but you would be surprised how often it needed to be clarified. Enter the entitled couple. I will call them Rick and Denise, because those names feel correct in a cosmic sense. Rick was loud in the way that suggests he confuses volume with authority. Denise was quieter, but sharper, like a knife that has opinions. They arrived together, trailing a smell that hit me a full 3 seconds before they did. It was the kind of odor that makes you briefly consider whether you are having a stroke. Sour, sweet, damp, layered. A bouquet, if the bouquet was left in a hot car with gym shoes and unresolved anger. Rick slammed a phone box on the counter. Not gently, this was a declaration. "We're returning this," he said, already annoyed that I existed. I smiled my customer service smile, the one that lives somewhere between hostage negotiation and retail therapy. "Sure thing. What seems to be the issue?" Denise leaned in. The smell intensified. I am not exaggerating when I say my eyes watered. "It doesn't work," she said. I asked what did not work. She waved vaguely at the universe. "It just doesn't." The phone in question was a flagship model, expensive, shiny, currently sticky. I put on gloves. This was not policy, but instinct. The screen was smeared with something that I can only describe as organic. Rick noticed the gloves and scoffed. "What, you scared of germs?" "Sir, I am scared of yours." I checked the purchase date, 28 days ago. I gently explained the return policy. 14 days. Rick interrupted me halfway through the word 14. "That's ridiculous. We didn't even really use it." The phone, reader, looked like it had been used to butter toast. Denise crossed her arms. "No one told us that." I pointed to the sign. She looked at it like it had personally betrayed her. "Well, we didn't read that." And there it is. The heart of entitlement. Reality is optional if it is inconvenient. I explained alternatives. Warranty, insurance, manufacturer support. I spoke calmly, kindly. Like one does when attempting to soothe a startled raccoon. Rick grew louder. Denise grew colder. The smell grew stronger, possibly emboldened by their confidence. It clung to the counter. It sank into the laminated surface like a curse. Rick leaned forward. "You're going to take this back." I explained again that I could not. He demanded a manager. I was the manager on duty. He demanded a real manager. I called my district manager. Rick complained loudly into the mall air about how customer service was dead and young people were lazy and also somehow responsible for the downfall of Western civilization. My district manager backed me up. Policy is policy. Rick hung up and said, "Fine, then give us a new one." "No." Denise sighed dramatically and said, "This is unbelievable. We spend so much money here." "You do not," I thought. "You bought one phone and some off-brand charger cable that you returned last year smelling like soup." They left in a huff. The smell stayed. I wiped the counter, twice. The disinfectant fought bravely but died on the battlefield. My coworker gagged. The pretzel stand guy asked if we had plumbing issues. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. 2 days later, Rick returned alone, this time with confidence, and a bag. A plastic grocery bag. My soul left my body briefly and then returned with a migraine. He put the bag on the counter and said, "I talked to corporate." This was a lie, but I let him continue. He pulled the phone out of the bag. It was wet. Not like water wet, like damp. Like it had been stored in a basement with feelings. The smell was worse, somehow more personal, like it knew my name. "I want a refund," he said. I asked why the phone was wet. He said, "That's none of your business." It was, unfortunately, very much my business. I explained again that the return window had passed and also the phone was damaged. He said it was like that when he bought it. I stared at him. He stared back. We shared a moment where reality tried to reassert itself and failed. Rick raised his voice. Again, people stared. The nail salon paused mid-acrylic. Denise was not there this time, but her spirit lingered in the smell. I refused. Calmly. Professionally. Rick threatened to call the police. I encouraged him to do so, mostly because I wanted a third party to experience this odor and validate my suffering. He did not call the police. Instead, he threw the phone back into the bag and stormed off. Again. The smell lingered. Again. A week later, a corporate complaint came through. Rick had written a novel. According to him, I was rude, discriminatory, and refused service because of his appearance. This was fascinating because I had not mentioned appearance. Smell is not appearance. Smell is a presence, a force. Corporate investigated. They asked for details. I provided timestamps, policy citations, photos of the phone taken with gloves on and regret in my heart. My district manager added notes about prior incidents. Rick was flagged as a repeat offender. Apparently he had done this at 3 other locations. One note simply read, "Odor issues." Corporate sided with us. Rick was banned from returns at our location. They sent a polite email explaining policy. Denise responded with several paragraphs in all caps. Corporate did not reply. The final chapter came a month later. Rick and Denise returned together. They approached the kiosk. I braced myself. Rick opened his mouth. Denise stopped him. She sniffed, frowned, and said, "We're not buying anything here." They left. The air improved immediately. I felt 10 years younger. I still think about them sometimes, about how entitlement rots things. Not just policies, but spaces. How refusing to read rules does not make you special, it just makes you loud. And how some smells are not just physical, but philosophical. I no longer work in cell phone sales. My nose is mostly recovered. But I still read return policies, religiously. And I shower, daily. Because living in society is a shared agreement, and soap is part of the deal. Anyway, thank you for watching.